Franz Kafka's The Trial, Chapter 1, The Arrest Conversation with Frau Grubach, then Fräulein Brünster. Someone must have traduced Joseph K., for without having done anything wrong, he was arrested one fine morning. His landlady's cook, who always brought him his breakfast at 8 o'clock, failed to appear on this occasion. That had never happened before. Kay waited for a little while longer, watching from his pillow the old lady opposite, who seemed to be peering at him with a curiosity unusual even for her, but then, feeling both put out and hungry, he rang the bell. At once there was a knock at the door, and a man entered whom he had never seen before in the house. He was slim and yet well knit. He wore a closely fitting black suit, which was furnished with all sorts of pleats, pockets, buckles, buttons, as well as a belt, like a tourist's outfit, and in consequence looked eminently practical, though one could not quite tell what actual purpose it served. "Who are you?" asked Kay, half raising himself in bed. But the man ignored the question as though his appearance needed no explanation, and merely said, "Did you ring?" "Anna is to bring me my breakfast," said Kay, and then studied the fellow silently and carefully, trying to make out who he could be. The man did not submit to this scrutiny for very long, but turned to the door and opened it slightly, so as to report to someone who was evidently standing just behind it, "He says Anna is to bring him his breakfast." A short guffaw from the next room came in answer, and it rather sounded as if several people had joined in. Although the strange man could not have learned anything from it that he did not know already, he now said to Kay, as if passing on a statement, "It can't be done." "This is news indeed," said Kay, springing out of bed and quickly pulling on his trousers. I must see what people these are next door, and how Frau Grubach came account to me for such behavior." Yet it occurred to him at once he should not have said this out loud, and that by doing so he had, in a way, admitted the stranger's right to superintend his actions. Still, that did not seem important to him at the moment. The stranger, however, took his words in some such sense, for he asked, "Hadn't you better stay here?" "I shall neither stay here nor let you address me until you have introduced yourself." "I meant well enough," said the stranger, and then of his own accord threw open the door. In the next room, which Kay entered more slowly than he had intended, everything looked, at first glance, almost as it had done the evening before. It was Frau Grubach's living room, though among all the furniture, rugs, china, and photographs with which it was crammed, there was a little more free space than usual, yet one did not perceive that at first, especially as the main change consisted in the presence of a man who was sitting at the open window reading a book, from which he now glanced up. "You should have stayed in your room. Didn't Franz tell you that?" "Yes, but what are you doing here?" asked Kay, looking now from his new acquaintance to the man called Franz, who was still standing in the door, and then back again. Through the open window he had another glimpse of the old woman, who, with truly senile inquisitiveness, had moved along to the window exactly opposite, in order to go on seeing all that could be seen. "I'd better get Frau Grubach," said Kay, as if wrenching himself away from the two men, though they were standing at quite a distance from him, and making as if to go out. "No," said the man at the window, flinging the book down on the table and getting up. "You can't go out. You're arrested." "So it seems," says Kay. "But what for?" "We are not authorized to tell you that. Go to your room and wait there. Proceedings have been instituted against you, and you will be informed of everything in due course. I am exceeding my instructions in speaking freely to you like this, but I hope nobody hears you except Franz, and he himself has been too free with you, against his express instructions. If you continue to have as good of a luck as you've had in your choice of wards, then you can be confident in the final result." Kay felt he must sit down, but now he saw that there were no seats in the whole room, except the chair beside the window. "You'll soon discover that we're telling you the truth," said Franz, advancing towards him simultaneously with the other man. The latter overtopped Kay enormously and kept clapping him on the shoulder. They both examined his nightshirt and said that he would have to wear a lot less fancy shirt now, but that they would take charge of this one and the rest of his underwear, and if his case turned out well, restore them to him later. "Much better give these things to us than hand them over to the depot," they said, "for in the depot there's lots of thieving, and besides, they sell everything there after a certain length of time, no matter whether your case is settled or not, and you never know how long these cases will last, especially these days. Of course, you would get the money out of the depot in the long run, but in the first place, the prices you pay are always wretched, for they sell your things to the best briber, not the best bidder, and anyhow, it's well known that money dwindles a lot if it passes from hand to hand from year to year." Kay hardly paid any attention to this advice. Any right to dispose of his own things which he might possess he did not prize very highly. Far more important to him was the necessity to understand a situation clearly, but with these people beside him he could not even think. The belly of the second warder, for they could only be warders, kept pushing up against him in an almost friendly way. Yet, if he looked up, he caught sight of a face which did not in the least suit that fat body. A dry, bony face with a great nose twisted to one side, which seemed to be consulting over his head with the other warder. Who could these men be? What were they talking about? What authority could they be representing? Kay lived in a country with a legal constitution. There was universal peace. All laws were in force. Who dared seize him in his own dwelling? He had always been inclined to take things easily, to believe in the worst only when the worst happened, to take no care for the morrow, even when the outlook was threatening. But that struck him as not being the right policy here. One could certainly regard the whole thing as a joke. A rude joke, which his colleagues at the bank had concocted for some unknown reason, perhaps because this was his 30th birthday. That was, of course, possible. Perhaps he'd only laugh knowingly to these men's faces, and they would laugh with him. Perhaps they were merely porters from the street corner. They very looked like it. Nevertheless, his very first glance at the man Franz had decided him, for the time, not to give away any advantage that he might possess over these people. There was a slight risk that later on his friends might possibly say he could not take a joke. But he had in mind several occasions of no importance in themselves, when against all his friends' advice he had behaved with deliberate recklessness and without the slightest regard for possible consequences, and had had in the end to pay dearly for it. That must not happen again, at least not this time, and if this is to be a comedy, he would insist on playing it out to the end. But he was still free. "Allow me," he said, passing quickly between the warders to his room. "He seems to have some sense," he heard one of them say behind him. When he reached his room, he at once pulled out the drawer to his desk. Everything lay there in perfect order. But in his agitation, he could not find, at first, the identification papers for which he was looking. At last, he found his bicycle license, and was about to start off with it to the warders, but then it seemed too trivial a thing. And he searched again until he found his birth certificate. As he was re-entering the next room, the opposite door opened, and Frau Grubach showed herself. He saw her only for an instant, for no sooner did she recognize him than she was obviously overcome with embarrassment, apologized for intruding, vanished, and shut the door again with the utmost care. "Oh, come in, do," he would have had time to say, but he merely stood holding his papers in the middle of the room, looking at the door, which did not open again, and was only recalled to attention by a shout from the warders, who were sitting at the table by the open window, and, as he now saw, devouring his breakfast. "Why didn't she come in?" he asked. "She isn't allowed to," said the tall warder, "since you're under arrest." "But how can I be under arrest, and particularly in such a ridiculous fashion?" "So now you're beginning it all over again," said the warder, dipping a slice of bread and butter into the honey pot. "We don't answer such questions. You'll have to answer them," said Kay. "Here are my papers. Now show me yours, and first of all, your warrant for arresting me." "Oh, good Lord. If you would only realize your position, you wouldn't insist on uselessly annoying us two, who probably mean better by you and stand closer to you than any other people in the world." "That's so, you can believe that," said Franz, not raising to his lips the coffee cup he held in his hand, but instead giving Kay a long, apparently significant, yet incomprehensible look. Without wishing it, Kay found himself decoyed into an exchange of speaking looks with Franz. Nonetheless, he tapped his papers and repeated, "Here are my identification papers." "What are your papers to us?" cried the tall warder. "You're behaving worse than a child. What are you after? Do you think you'll bring this fine case of yours to a speedier end by wrangling with us, your warders, over papers and warrants? We are humble subordinates who can scarcely find our way through a legal document and have nothing to do with your case except to stand guard over you for 10 hours a day and draw our pay for it. That's all we are, but we're quite capable of grasping the fact that the high authorities we serve, before they would order such an arrest as this, must be quite well informed about the reasons for the arrest and the person of the prisoner. There can be no mistake about that. Our officials, so far as I know them, and I know only the lowest grades about them, never go hunting for crime in the populace, but, as the law decrees, are drawn towards the guilty and must send out us warders. That is the law. How could there be a mistake in that?" "I don't know this law," said Kay. "All the worse for you," replied the warder. "And it probably exists nowhere but in your own head," said Kay. He wanted in some way to enter into the thoughts of the warders and twist them to his own advantage, or else try to acclimate himself to him. But the warder merely said in a discouraging voice, You'll come up against it yet, Franz interrupted. See, Wilhelm, he admits he doesn't know the law, and yet he claims he's innocent. You're quite right, but you'll never make a man like that see reason, replied the other. Kay gave no further answer. Must I, he thought, let myself be confused still worse by the gabble of those wretched hirelings? They admit themselves that's all they are. They're talking of things, in any case, which they don't understand. Plain stupidity is the only thing that can give them such assurance. A few words with a man on my own level of intelligence would make everything far clearer than hours of talk with these two. He walked up and down a few times in the free part of the room, and at the other side of the street he could still see the old woman, who had now dragged to the window an even older man, whom she was holding around the waist. Kay felt he must put an end to this farce. Take me to your superior officer, he said. When he orders me, not before, retorted the warder called Wilhelm. And now I advise you, he went on, to go to your room and stay quietly there and wait for what may be decided about you. Our advice to you is to not let yourself be distracted by vain thoughts, but to collect yourself, for great demands will be made upon you. You haven't treated us as our kind advances to you deserved. You have forgotten that we, no matter who we may be, are at least free men compared to you. That is no small advantage. All the same, we are prepared, if you have any money, to bring you a little breakfast from the coffee house across the street. Without replying to this offer, Kay remained standing where he was for a moment. If he were to open the door to the next room, or even the door leading to the hall, perhaps the two of them would not dare to hinder him. Perhaps that would be the simplest solution of the whole business, and bring it to the head. But perhaps they might seize him after all, and he were once down, all the superiority would be lost, which in a certain sense he still retained. Accordingly, instead of a quick solution, he chose the certainty which the natural course of things would be bound to bring, and went back to his room without another word having been said by him or by the warders. He flung himself on his bed and took from the wash-bed a fine apple which he had laid out the night before for his breakfast. Now it was all the breakfast he would have, but in any case, as the first few bites assured him, much better than the breakfast from the filthy night cafe would have been, which the grace of his warders might have secured him. He felt fit and confident, and he would miss his work. He felt fit and confident. He would miss his work in the bank that morning, it was true, but that would be easily overlooked, considering the comparatively high post he had there. Should he give the real reason for his absence? He considered doing so. If they did not believe him, which in the circumstances would be understandable, he could produce Frau Grubach as a witness, or even the two odd creatures over the way, who were now probably meandering back again to the window opposite his room. Kay was surprised, at least he was surprised considering the warder's point of view, that they had sent him to his room and left him alone there, where he had abundant opportunity to take his life. Though at the same time he also asked himself, looking at it from his own point of view, what possible ground he could have to do so. Because the two warders were sitting next door and had interceded his breakfast? To take his life would be such a senseless act that even if he wished, he could not bring himself to do it because of its very senselessness. If the intellectual poverty of the wardens were not so manifest, he might also assume that they too saw no danger in leaving him alone for the very same reason. They were quite at liberty to watch him now while he went to a wall cupboard where he kept a bottle of good brandy, while he filled his glass and drank it down to make up for his breakfast, and then drank a second to give him courage, and the last one only as a precaution for the improbable contingency that it might be needed. Then a shout came from the next room which made him start so violently that his teeth rattled against the glass. "The inspector wants you," was its tenor. It was merely the tone of it that startled him, a curt military bark with which he would not have credited the warder Franz. The command itself was actually welcome to him. "At last!" he shouted back, closing the cupboard and hurrying at once to the next room. There the two warders were standing, and as if that were a matter of course, immediately drove him back into his room again. "What are you thinking of?" they cried. "Do you imagine you can appear before the inspector in your shirt? He'll have you well thrashed and us too." "Leave me alone, damn you," cried Kay, who by now had been forced back to his warm wardrobe. "If you grab me out of bed, you can't expect to find me all dressed up in my best suit." "That can't be helped," said the warders, who, as soon as Kay raised his voice, always grew quite calm, indeed almost melancholy, and thus contrived either to confuse him or to some extent bring him to his senses. "Silly formalities," he growled, but immediately lifted a coat from a chair and held it up for a little while in both hands, as if displaying it to the warders for their approval. They shook their heads. "It must be a black coat," they said. Thereupon Kay flung the coat to the floor and said, he did not himself know in what sense he meant the words, "But this isn't even the capital charge yet." The warder smiled, but stuck to their, "It must be a black coat." "If it's to dispatch my case any quicker, I don't mind," replied Kay, opening the wardrobe where he searched for a long time among his many suits, chose his best black one, a lounge suit which had caused almost a sensation among his acquaintances because of its elegance, then selected another shirt and began to dress with great care. In his secret heart, he thought that he had managed, after all, to speed up the proceedings, for the warders had forgotten to make him take a bath. He kept an eye on them to see if they would remember the ducking, but, of course, it never occurred to them. Yet, on the other hand, Wilhelm did not forget to send Franz to the inspector with the information that Kay was dressing. When he was fully dressed, he had to walk, with Wilhelm treading on his heels, through the next room, which was now empty, to the adjoining one, whose double doors were flung open. This room, as Kay knew quite well, had recently been taken by a Fräulein Brunster, a typist, who went very early to work, came home very late, and with whom he had exchanged little more than a few words in passing. Now the night table beside her bed had been pushed into the middle of the floor to serve as a desk, and the inspector was sitting behind it. He had crossed his legs, and one arm was resting on the back of the chair. In the corner of the room, 3 young men were standing looking at Fräulein Brunster's photographs, which were stuck into a mat hanging on the wall. A white blouse dangled from the latch of the open window. In the window over the way, the 2 old creatures were again stationed, but they had enlarged their party. For behind them, towering head and shoulders above them, stood a man with a shirt open to the neck and a reddish-pointed beard, which he kept pinching and twisting with his fingers. "Joseph Kay?" asked the inspector, perhaps merely to draw Kay's roving glance upon himself. Kay nodded. "You are presumably very much surprised at the events of this morning?" asked the inspector, with both hands rearranging the few things that lay on the night table, a candle and a matchbox and a book and a pushpin, as if they were objects which he required for his interrogation. "Certainly," said Kay, and he was filled with pleasure at having encountered a sensible man at least, with whom he could discuss the matter. "Certainly I am surprised, but I am by no means very much surprised." "Not very much surprised?" asked the inspector, settling the candle in the middle of the table, and then grouping the other things around it. "Perhaps you misunderstand me," Kay hastened to add. "I mean—" Here Kay stopped and looked around him for a chair. I suppose I may sit down?" he asked. "It is not usual," answered the inspector. "I mean," said Kay, without further parley, "that I am very much surprised, of course, but when one has lived for 30 years in this world and had to fight one's way through it, as I have had to do, one becomes hardened to surprises and doesn't take them too seriously. Particularly this morning." "Why particularly the one this morning?" "I won't say that I regard the whole thing as a joke, for the preparations that have been made seem too elaborate for that. The whole staff of the boarding house would have had to have been involved, as well as all you people, and that would be past a joke. So I don't say that it's a joke." "Quite right," said the inspector, looking to see now how many matches were in the matchbox. "But on the other hand," Kay went on, turning to everybody there, he wanted to bring in the 3 young men standing beside the photographs as well. "On the other hand, it can't be an affair of any great importance either. I argue this from the fact that I thought I was accused, that though I am accused of something, I cannot recall the slightest offense that might have been charged against me. But that even is of minor importance. The real question is, who accuses me? What authority is conducting these proceedings? Are you officers of the law? None of you have a uniform, unless your suit," here he turns to Franz, "is to be considered a uniform. But it's more like a tourist's outfit. I demand a clear answer to these questions, and I feel sure that after an explanation, we shall be able to part from each other on the best of terms." The inspector flung the matchbox down on the table. "You are laboring under a great delusion," he said. "These gentlemen here and myself have no standing whatsoever in this affair of yours. Indeed, we know hardly anything about it. We might wear the most official uniforms, and your case might not be a penny the worse. I can't even confirm that you are charged with any offense, or rather, I don't know whether you are. You are under arrest, certainly. More than that, I do not know. Perhaps the warders have given you a different impression, but they are only irresponsible gossips. However, if I can't answer your questions, I can at least give you a piece of advice. Think less about us and of what is going to happen to you. Think more about yourself instead. And don't make such an outcry about your feeling innocent. It spoils the not unfavorable impression you make in other respects. Also, you should be far more reticent. Nearly everything you have just said could have been implied in your behavior, with the help of a word here and there. In any case, does not redound particularly to your credit. Kay stared at the inspector. Was he being taught lessons in manners by a man probably younger than himself? To be punished for his frankness by a rebuke? And about the cause of his arrest and about his instigator? Was he to learn nothing? He was thrown into a certain agitation and began to walk up and down. Nobody hindered him. Pushed back his cuffs, fingered his shirt front, ruffled his hair, and as he passed the 3 young men said, "This is sheer nonsense," whereupon they turned toward him and regarded him sympathetically but gravely. At last he came to stand before the inspector's table. "Hasterer, the lawyer, is a personal friend of mine," he said. "May I telephone him?" "Certainly," replied the inspector. "But I don't see what sense there would be in that, unless you have some private business of your own to consult him about." "What sense would there be in that?" cried Kay, more in amazement than in exasperation. "What kind of man are you, then? You ask me to be sensible, and you carry on in the most senseless way imaginable yourself? It's enough to sicken the dogs. People first fall upon me in my own house, and then lounge about the room and put me through my paces for your benefit. What sense would there be in telephoning to a lawyer when I'm supposed to be under arrest? All right, I won't telephone." "But do telephone if you want to," replied the inspector, waving an arm towards the entrance hall, where the telephone was. "Please, do telephone." "No, I don't want to now," said Kay, going over to the window. Across the street, the party of 3 was still on the watch, and their enjoyment of the spectacle received its first slight check when Kay appeared in the window. The 2 old people moved up as if to get up, but the man at the back pacified them. "Here's a fine crowd of spectators," cried Kay in a loud voice to the inspector, pointing at them with his finger. "Go away," he shouted across. The 3 of them immediately retreated a few steps, the 2 ancients actually taking cover behind the stronger young man, who shielded them with his massive body, and to judge from the movements of his lips was saying something which owing to the distance could not be distinguished. Yet they did not remove themselves altogether, but seemed to be waiting for the chance to return to the window again, unobserved. "Officious, inconsiderate wretches," said Kay, as he turned back to the room again. The inspector was possibly of the same mind, Kay fancied, as far as he could tell from the hasty side glance. But it was equally possible that the inspector was not even listening, for he had pressed one hand firmly to the table, and seemed to be comparing the lengths of his fingers. The 2 warders sat on a chest draped with embroidered cloth, rubbing their knees. The 3 young men were looking aimlessly around the room with their hands on their hips. It was as quiet as a deserted office. "Come, gentlemen," cried Kay. It seemed to him for a moment as if he were responsible for all of them. "From the look of you, this affair of mine seems to be settled. In my opinion, the best thing now would be to bother no more about the justice or injustice of your behavior, and settle the matter amicably by shaking hands on it. If you are of the same opinion, why then—" And he stepped over to the inspector's table and held out his hand. The inspector raised his eyes, bit his lips, and looked over at Kay and his stretched out hand. Kay still couldn't believe he was going to close with the offer. But instead, he got up, seized a hard round hat laying on Fraulein Brewster's bed, and with both hands put it carefully upon his head as if he were trying it on for the first time. "How simple it all seems to you," he said to Kay as he did so. "You think we should settle the matter amicably, do you? No, that really can't be done. On the other hand, I don't mean to suggest that you should give up hope. Why should you? You are only under arrest, nothing more. I was requested to inform you of this. I have done so, and I will also observe your reactions. That is enough for today, and we can say goodbye. Though only for the time being, naturally. You'll be going to the bank now, I suppose?" "To the bank?" asked Kay. "I thought I was under arrest." Kay asked the question with a certain defiance, for though his offer to shake hands had been ignored, he felt more and more independent of all these people, especially now that the inspector had risen to his feet. He was playing with them. He considered the idea of running after them to the front door as they left and challenging them to take him prisoner. So he said again, "How can I go to the bank if I am under arrest?" "I see," said the inspector, who had already reached the door. "You have misunderstood me. You are under arrest, certainly, but that need not hinder you from going about your business, nor will you be prevented from leading your ordinary life." "Then arresting can't be so very bad," said Kay, going to the inspector. "I never suggested it was," said the inspector. "But in that case, it would seem that there was no particular necessity to tell me about it," said Kay, moving still closer. The others had drawn near, too. They were all gathered now in a little space beside the door. "It was my duty," said the inspector. "A stupid duty," said Kay inflexibly. "That may be," replied the inspector, "but we needn't waste our time with such arguments. I was assuming you would go back to the bank. If you are such a quibbler over words, let me add that I am not forcing you to go to the bank. I was merely assuming that you would want to go. And to facilitate that, and render your arrival at the bank as unobtrusive as possible, I have detained these 3 gentlemen here, who are colleagues of yours, to be at your disposal." "What?" cried Kay, gaping at the 3 of them. The insignificant, anemic young men whom he had observed only as a group standing beside the photographs were actually clerks in the bank, not colleagues of his. That was putting it too strongly, and indicated a gap in the omniscience of the inspector. But they were subordinate employees of the bank all the same. How could he have failed to notice that? He must have been very much taken up with the inspector and the warders not to recognize these 3 young men.